Good afternoon. We're resuming the narrative. Having seen the film, we're going to now sort of analyze things more deeply. And you see the difference between documentary, which, good as it is, not the same thing as a kind of analytical approach to why things are happening. I'm reading your exams with pleasure, and generally speaking, the results are good. I'll have some, I think I can send back the results over the weekend, and I'll have some brief comments on what I think about them in terms of your work and your overall work in the class. So,
just sorry to interrupt. There's a waiting room that you had, so I don't know. There's only one person, me, with you right now in class. So if there's a waiting,
there are 10.
If they're in the waiting room, so you need to admit them because they can't hear you.
How do I do that?
I honestly don't know. There should be an option, perhaps you see them in the participants, maybe in more. You can click on and hit accept.
How did you get in?
I was just, it said I was waiting for the professor to let me in, and then I was let in.
I don't see how this is really I went to AI and
perhaps if you click on the participants, because I assume that's where you see the 10. If you click that button, and then you'll see all the names. Perhaps if you go and look at just a name that isn't Henry Heller or Christopher Riedel, and then there should be a button that pops up that says more, and perhaps there's something in there that says admit.
I don't get it. I see more people are entering, but I don't see. Maybe somebody else has some idea.
It's only me that can communicate with you. The rest are in a waiting room right now.
It's such a good lecture. Oh, admit all. I see that.
There, and then there they all go. Yeah, they all come in now.
Oh, great.
So that's just
so much for your help.
Yeah, you need to do that now, I assume, from now on.
Yeah, I have to do that now.
Yeah. So
it's really, it's you're just feeling your way all the time. So welcome. I'm getting through the exams, and you'll probably have the result on Sunday. And today's lecture follows the showing of the film and sort of takes things deeper, and we'll see the consequences of TED as well. Any questions about where we're going? Okay, now during 1965, 1966, as you'll remember, in pursuit of Westmoreland's overall strategy for dealing with the crisis situation, the first phase of his plan was basically a stabilization and buildup. And this proceeded in 1965 and 1966. There were some delays, and it was only in 1967 that Westmoreland was able to go on the offensive. This is the well-known search and destroy strategy, which I explained 2 classes ago. And then, of course, looking ahead, the success of that search and destroy was supposed to lead to a mopping up operation, forcing Hanoi to the negotiating table. So the NLF and the PAVN responded, for the most part, during 65, 66, by basically going over to guerrilla warfare. There were some big battles, but for the most part, they broke up their units into smaller units to avoid the enormous firepower of the Americans. And they were basically trying to inflict as many casualties on the Americans as they could, and also to try and force the Americans to fight in many, many different places so that their strength would be dissipated. It was essentially a defensive operation. And as I explained, in terms of the setup for the Americans, they had about 400,000 troops. There were 800,000 ARVN at this point, mostly confined to sort of passive defense, and only about 150,000 or 140,000 American troops are actually available for combat operations. The rest of them were in support, because as you understand, in modern warfare, logistics and support is very important. And so a lot of the actual combat troops are limited, and these support operations are very important. So we're now into 1967, and now we see some really big battles and a lot of casualties on both sides. And the Americans were fighting up by the demilitarized zone between North and South Vietnam. This is a heavily wooded, hilly area, and there was a lot of communist infiltration from the north into the demilitarized zone. Also up in the highlands, in the mountainous areas, also forested and with good concealment. These were the rear areas of the communists. Likewise, around Saigon, again, there were forests, and many of the NLF were in these tunnels. Today, people are taken for tours of these tunnels, of which it said there were 20,000 kilometers of tunnels that the NLF dug in and around the city of Saigon to operate close to the capital. Invariably, when large battles were fought, the outcome was determined by the massive firepower of the Americans. They could always bring in air power. They had artillery. In fact, you should realize that one of their incredible strategies was that they built these fortified artillery placements virtually through the whole countryside. And these were forts with heavy artillery in them, and they could target from these forts any place on the territory of the Republic of Vietnam. In addition, of course, they had their air power, fighter bombers, a lot of them launched from carriers. There were enormous numbers of ships offshore, including carrier forces. And these forces were used to bomb in Vietnam. And finally, the B-52s, which could decimate any significant concentration of communist troops. So both sides, as I said, were taking heavy casualties at this point. The Americans were, reporting over 200 and sometimes as high as 400 casualties in any given week. And it began to, this is attrition, and it began to sort of get on the nerves of people back in the States. There's so many losses, and we're not even speaking about the wounded. Of course, people tend to focus on the killed, but the wounded people are maimed for life. So it's quite significant, and there were many more of those. Well, the communists always basically determined when the fight would occur, because they could always withdraw, and they did withdraw when the conditions were not quite right. They would simply pull out, and so they only fought when they thought that they could get some sort of advantage. Now, as I explained in the previous lecture, the strategy of the communists was, of course, guerrilla warfare, but also looking beyond that. Their idea was to spread the Americans out as far as possible, to force them to fight on many different little fronts, and especially in areas, in these remoter areas, the DMZ or the Central Highlands, to draw the American troops away from the towns and cities, because what they had in mind since the spring of 1967 was basically attacking the towns and cities. And so this was the basic, that was part of the basic strategy. Now, it's true that the communist forces, both the PAVN and the NLF, suffered heavy casualties, certainly more casualties than the Americans, but their numbers kept growing all through this period. And certainly they were highly organized, as they explained, based on the villages. And of course, the PAVN forces were regular army troops, quite well organized. I would, to repeat, the estimate is 1/3 of the villagers were essentially members of the NLF. The rest were either sitting on their fence or they were against the NLF. But the numbers in supporting the NLF actually were diminishing because there was so much bombing in South Vietnam that a lot of the anti-communist elements amongst the peasantry basically left for the cities. They retreated to the cities, and in the cities, rather in the countryside, the peasants who remained tend to be more favorable to the NLF, is what I'm saying. Meanwhile, the peasants who went into the cities, they had few, if any, resources. They were ragtag elements. As somebody described them as a chaos of fallen leaves. That is to say, they had lost their hold on some sort of organic life. They were in the city looking for any kind of work that they could get. They are what is sometimes described as lumpen elements, or marginal elements. And of course, we see this in a city like Winnipeg. There are all these people. Where do they come from? The people that you see on the street, or people who are have the most wretched housing in Winnipeg. A lot of them come from elsewhere or rural Manitoba, and their roots, they've broken their roots in the countryside, more or less. They're in the city and they haven't connected in terms of work or establishing some sort of stable family life. This is what I'm describing. These are the people, and there were many. There were several million that fled to the urban areas. And as I said, that these years of conflict from 65 onwards, there was a rapid urbanization of Vietnam, because literally millions of people left to get away from the bombing. Now, it was from this element that the Vietnamese, South Vietnamese government tried to recruit its army, which ultimately grew by 1971 to 1.2 million men, and younger men tended to enlist because they had no other work. I explained that the urban economy depended on American support, and job creation really was minimal in this situation, and real production was minimal. It all depended on having access to whatever the Americans were prepared to distribute. And of course, they distributed billions of dollars. And so what you see is General Tu, who, as I said, did create a more or less stable government, a military government, with a veneer of sort of legislative assembly and so on, but for all practical purposes, the military controlled things. Well, these guys were basically military politicians. They had little or no interest in carrying on a war, and they and the Chinese and the new Vietnamese bourgeoisie, all of whom had access to American money, they were the ones who animated economic life in the towns. We're not speaking about the countryside, in the towns. And they opened all kinds of businesses. They engaged in real estate deals of all kinds. There was a boom, commercial and real estate boom based on American aid. But that American aid was indispensable. Without it, the whole apparatus would collapse. And eventually it did collapse, as you'll see. And of course, I pointed out earlier that absence of a real economy was, and dependency on the United States was a fundamental weakness of this South Vietnamese government. Are there any questions about this, or is it clear?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So in 1966, 65, the NLF and PAVN troops go back to guerrilla warfare. Are they also using like superior firepower doctrine at this point? Like we saw at Dien Bien Phu, are they still using those like large howitzers in combat?
Ooh,
or is this...
the communists?
Yes.
No, they're not. The PAVN troops are interesting because they could fight both in positional warfare and fight as guerrillas. They would break down. They did both, depending on the adversary. And so, but I would say no. But you'll see that at the Tet Offensive, certain things became that some of the PAVN troops were not only were they heavily equipped, but you'll see that they coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, some of them they attacked some of these artillery positions, as I'll point out in a few minutes, and they had tanks. They had tanks. They attacked the American positions with tanks as well as infantry. Now, how did they do this? They did this because the Ho Chi Minh Trail, what you have to understand is it starts as basically a jungle trail or a series of sort of intertwined little roads through the jungle. And they purposely built it like it wasn't simply one road. They would have several roads at the same time, like a web of sort of mud roads or clay roads, and covered over by the forest. So when the Americans attacked, they would bomb one road, but there was a road right next to it, or two roads, so they could take another route. And that's this kind of interlaced network is the way the Ho Chi Minh Trail operated. While eventually by 68, it was becoming so developed that you could actually bring tanks from North Vietnam down to South Vietnam, which is exactly what they did. So this indicates growing capacity is really what I'm talking about. The military capacity of the North Vietnamese is increasing. Okay, but having said that, I want to say, and you'll see this in the outcome of the battle, that when the Pavin and the NLF attacked the cities and the towns, the people in the towns, not everybody, there were secret communist sympathizers. Of course, the students, they were always troublemakers. There were a lot of communists amongst the students and other elements in the towns. Of course, that was part of the scene. But overwhelmingly, the town population turned its back on the communists. They were either they were anti-communist or they were basically the Americans had created this kind of artificial economy. They were participating in that. So they were not interested. And certainly the communist objective in the Tet Offensive was basically to actually win the towns, to conquer the towns, not simply by invading, but to get the urban population to rise up against the Arvin and the Americans. Well, that didn't happen. It didn't happen. And of course, it certainly, in terms of the overall goals of the communist side, in that sense, the offensive failed. It's complicated. You'll see in a few minutes. Any further questions about this? Because we're all leading up to the battle. Of course, this is what's spending.
I have a question again.
Yeah.
So what are other members of the Seato Alliance? Like I know there's like Australian forces in
That's right.
in Vietnam, but I'm
For
just curious.
South Korean forces, Australian forces, some Filipino forces. Those were, I think, the Brits were there as advisors and so on, like this, the attempt to, for example, set up these strategic hamlets. The British were experts at detention camps and so on. They had done a lot of this in Kenya and in Malaya, and they brought that to Vietnam. So there were, and as I said, the Canadians were fortunate in being able to stay out because they were on the ICC. Is there anything else you'd like to know? We're really setting things up for what is about to happen. And remember, you can forget about land reform. Two only brought in land reform after most of the land had basically been taken by the National Liberation Front. So he couldn't make political points about that. Okay, that's the situation of Vietnam, but very important in the outcome of all this is the situation within the United States, and this is what I want to look at. Because we remember way back at '65 when the American intervention started, well, there was a demonstration and agitation in the universities, anti-war sentiment, but also anti sort of bureaucratic universities, and a lot of agitation around civil rights. And on that basis, then, first opposition developed. And there was the first demonstration in Washington in April '65, which I spoke about. Well, Johnson had overwhelming support for what he was doing in terms of public opinion. I would say that, and this we could talk about a little bit. What is freaking public opinion anyway? Yeah, what is public opinion? Like they bring out these polls, and what are we to make of that in terms of real politics? What is that all about? Anybody have any ideas about this? Are we to take this seriously? Polling? What do you think? Well, at best, I would say it's a mere sort of snapshot. It's a mere sort of indicator. Public opinion, especially in North America, and for that matter in Europe, is extremely mercurial. It changes all the time. And you can't, you can't, oh, it's sort of like what is it? What it is a kind of, it's a kind of sort of a substitute for actual political, democratic decision making. The people speak. Instead of allowing the people to actually participate in making real political decisions, they take polls and then they say, these firms who work for the government of the day or for business, they basically say the public feels this way, the public feels that way, et cetera, et cetera. But the public really, is silent. As silent as you are in the class. Yeah, I'm doing the talking, you're listening. And what you really feel and what you really want is obscure, it's hidden. Who can say? I'm trying to suggest, some of the sort of realities of the kind of politics that we live with even now. It's the same setup. In any case, I said by 65, Johnson had overwhelming support, but by 67, the situation had changed radically. The anti-war movement had grown into a giant. Let's be clear, it did not constitute a majority, but it was roundabout 40 or 45% of the American public opinion was against the war, if we can put it that crudely. And the anti-war demonstrations were in the millions and millions at this point. The largest public demonstration in history occurred only very recently in the United States, and for that matter in Canada. Does anybody know what that demonstration was? It was the Black Lives Matter demonstration. The Black Lives Matter. Well, so I'm saying that was the biggest demonstration. And maybe you have the idea that things have calmed down. On the contrary, today things are way more serious, especially because we live in the main reason is that whereas in the 60s, economic times were good. Today, economic times for most people in American and Canadian society is bad. It's difficult. And so the potential for mobilization is actually greater now than it was back then. And of course, that's what politicians, they know that. I'm talking about Canadian politicians as well as American politicians. It's a big factor, but it's underneath, you don't see it. But what I'm saying is that the war and other factors in American society had led to a situation where the anti-war movement had become gigantic. But underneath the anti-war movement, there were there were other agendas that had emerged. And I would say, I'm going to describe this, but the thing is that internally within the United States, there is the war in Vietnam, but within the United States, a kind of quasi-insurrectionary mood had begun to emerge within the United States. People were agitated, certain elements of the population were agitated, and they were making a lot of trouble for the government about Vietnam, but also a lot of other things. In the universities, there was huge agitation against the whole apparatus. The students felt that they were alienated. Universities were a shitty place. You couldn't find any friends. You were alienated. It was bureaucratic. Where was this all going? the whole structure was, who knew who had the power in these universities? The students were out on the campuses protesting this, and it was fueled by the anti-war movement, and it was fueled also by the civil rights movement, which was becoming the Black Power movement. And so ultimately millions in the streets making all kinds of demands. And it was basically, yes, the United States was fighting a war in Vietnam, but they had to confront increasingly a war situation within the United States. And I'll explain this in a minute. Anyway, the anti-war movement, I would say 40 or 45% of the population said that the war was wrong. The United States had to get out, was the view. And of course, most of these people were on the left of US politics. And when they voted, if they did vote, they voted for the Democrats. Now, I would say there were two elements. There were the liberals. When I say liberals, American liberals, which are more or less the same as Canadian liberals. Somebody like Joe Biden is an example of an American liberal, okay? Or back then, Robert Kennedy, who was John Kennedy's brother, he sort of embodied these forces. They basically said, look, the Vietnam War is a big mistake. It's a huge political mistake. We fell into a quagmire. There were mistakes made. We're sorry. Let's get out. That was the liberal position. That was the liberal position. And they, of course, bemoaned the destruction and all the rest that was happening and so on. People were wringing their hands. The other element of the anti-war movement, and these people, both the liberals and what we can call them radicals, were known as doves. After the peace dove, they were doves. They stood for peace. That's where this peace symbol comes from, and so on. There were these doves on the one hand, and the radicals amongst them, they went much further than the liberals. They basically said, this is all about American imperialism. They had essentially a Marxist or quasi-Marxist view. Marxism was gaining popularity, especially amongst the young. And they basically said, this is a product of US imperialism and the class structure of the United States. The United States is a capitalist country, it's imperialist, and this is really where all of this comes from. If you want some explanation of what I'm saying, just ask. So that's who made up the doves. But against the doves were the people who wanted to continue the war. And indeed, some of them wanted to escalate the war. These were the hawks. And they numbered about 1/3 of the American population. And mainly came from the Republican Party, but also there were conservative Democrats who felt that way. And they took this position that we have to press on. Some of them said that the policy of containment is right. This is generally conservative Democrats would take this position. They would say containment is important, and therefore the war may be nasty, but we have to continue. We have to support Johnson, and so on. And this was a lot of Republicans and some Democrats took this position. But also amongst the hawks were people who were way more extreme. And their view was, the problem is this policy of escalation, of gradualism, of not taking the war to the enemy, of playing games with the enemy. We have to hit the enemy full force. We have to hit them with nuclear weapons, and we have to invade North Vietnam. And if we did that within a matter of days, we would win. can anybody tell me what would be the objection to this policy? Why would some people become frightened by, or they would out of hand reject this policy? Why is that?
Because like the wanton use of nuclear weapons would see retaliation attacks most likely,
From whom?
like other communists like the Soviets.
Yes, the basic thing was they feared, the whole point was to avoid full-scale Chinese and Soviet involvement. And the basic view was that if the Americans invaded the North or invoked drastic means, that China and Russia would enter the war. And so that's why they were against it. Now, another element that we should mention was the attitude of the working class in the United States. There's the middle class and there's the working. I'm talking about factory workers. And at this time, the majority of factory workers were white, and they enjoyed a good standard of living. Not fabulous, but you could have a nice way of life, working in there were lots of jobs, and the white working class, well, these people tended to be, most of the majority of them were Democrats, but they were conservative Democrats. The white working class stuck with Johnson, stuck with containment, the war against communism, all of that. Like a lot of working class people came from Eastern Europe, and they were against communism, and so and they didn't like these students and those who were complaining and whining and were cowards. That's the way the white working class viewed these people. And so I'm not saying all of the workers. Obviously, some workers were Marxists, communists, but I'm talking about the great majority. But what's notable is, of course, that you see American society is divided on the war in Vietnam, and what we can say is the consensus of anti-communism, of seamless anti-communism, on which the Cold War was based, had broken down by 1967. The whole Cold War thing, which was started by Truman, it was based on a consensus in the United States. And do you have trust in the government? Overwhelming numbers back in 1947, 48, 49. Yes, we trust the government completely. By 67, the situation has completely changed, and it has never gone back. The American public does not trust its government since Vietnam. That's a basic fact. I would say that that's not true in Canada, but in the United States, it is true. Please, I'm saying a lot of things. If you want to have a little discussion, you have an opinion, by all means, intervene and say something. Now, the thing is that, so the Doves were very powerful, but not all that powerful in numbers. But they also, the Doves, a lot of them, and the ones that were more outspoken, they were in the universities. They lived in places like Chicago, Philadelphia, LA, San Francisco, New York City, the big cities, the university campuses, the places where public opinion was formed in the United States. And over time, the anti-war opinions began to, well, we see it's already 45%. It gets stronger and stronger and stronger as we go on. It begins even to affect the armed forces, these attitudes. And yeah, so far as the universities goes, well, the anti-war movement starts at Michigan, at Harvard, at Berkeley, and so on. But by 67, virtually all the university campuses, the students in the great majority were against the war. And one of the, well, they had all these reasons. You know, the amount of radicalism was very great because they felt that American society was sick. But also, male students were subject to the draft in the United States. If you men 18 and over had to register for the draft, and sooner or later you had to expect you would be conscripted into the U.S. Army. You had as a citizen, and so the thought of going to Vietnam at this point, especially given the casualties, people were frightened. Young people and young men began to flee into Canada as a result of all of this. But there was also the anti-war was fun. And being anti-war was fun for the students. Protesting was fun. There were schools like, I read an article about a school, Southern Illinois University. It's not a bad place. Absolutely not. They have a good faculty and so on now. But back then, a lot of these universities were new, and Southern Illinois University, which had grown very large, it was over 20,000 students. It was known as a party school. Going to Southern Illinois, you could have a good time in Southern Illinois. You could study, get a degree, etc. But on the weekends, there were these big parties. And this article describes the situation down there. And these fraternities, these sororities, all these social clubs, they combined anti-war. They would agitate during the day, go on a protest, and then at night there would be an all-out party and so on going on. There was a kind of festive, defiant mood in many of these universities. In any case, Johnson was in a bad spot because the left in the United States, a near majority of the Democratic Party, they hated Johnson by this point. Johnson was the enemy. So his own party had turned against him. And then we come to a very important element. That is to say, the Black population of the United States of America. The evolution of Black opinion is very important. Now, Black opinion was led, who was the leader of the civil rights movement? Does anybody know? In the United States. A saint. This guy was a saint. What's his name? They have a holiday there celebrating this guy.
Martin Luther King Jr.
That's right. And he was a nonviolence guy. Passive resistance, nonviolent. Very political, at the same time, moral leadership. He was a pastor. And he said as little as possible about the war in Vietnam and what Johnson was up to. Does anybody know why he did that? And why somebody like that should have been opposed, should have been openly opposed to Johnson's policy. Why did he? Well, yes, that's true. He didn't to alternate the side, but the real reason was the Great Society programs of Johnson. Johnson had started his presidency in the wake of the death of John Kennedy. Said we are going to launch this war against poverty, and billions and billions of dollars were spent basically helping poor people to elevate themselves. And some of this actually worked. Of course, we've gone backwards many times since then, but there was a general boost, and the Black population benefited a great deal from the Great Society programs. And so Martin Luther King, of course, was completely opposed to the war, but he kept his mouth shut. But the problem was that pressure was getting stronger and stronger to say something, especially because when you broke down the numbers of who were the troops in Vietnam, and who were the ones who were taking the casualties, overwhelmingly and disproportionately, Blacks were the casualties. I'm not saying they were majority and so on, but disproportionately, they were suffering more than the white population. And furthermore, by the time that we're talking about, by 1967, the whole character of the movement amongst Black people had changed. It started out, as I said, the civil rights movement, passive resistance, integration into the main line of of American society is what Martin Luther called for in his great speeches. But by 1967, the center of gravity of the Black movement had shifted from the South, where it started, to the northern cities, to the ghettos in the northern cities. And instead of passive resistance and integration, the call was for Black power in the form of Black nationalists, the Black Muslims, Black nationalists, and Black revolutionary Marxists embodied in an organization known as the Black Panthers. The Black Panthers and the Black Muslims, these two groups. And instead of passive resistance, basically the call on the part of both of these groups was basically overt armed resistance to racism and the whole white establishment in the United States. And so we see that between 1965 and 1968, when this movement of Black power emerged in the United States, in the cities, there were major riots verging on insurrections in the Black ghettos. Whole areas of something like 140 American cities were burned down by the Black population. It was a virtually insurrectionary state. And when it came to politics, the Black Power movement, they rejected the whole political structure in the United States. They basically identified with the third world liberation movements. They basically said, we're an occupied people. The United States, basically the army and police in the United States basically occupied the Black ghettos, and our real allies are the National Liberation Front, the Viet Cong are our allies, and also the Cuban Revolution, Castro, Che Guevara, and the other revolutionaries spread in places like Latin America and in Latin America, in Africa. And so far as the war in Vietnam went, it was an imperialist war. This was the situation. And on the 4th of April, 1967, Martin Luther King speaks for the first time about the war in Vietnam. And he roundly denounces the war. He says, he declares that the Vietnam War is, quote, a symptom of a far deeper malady. It's a symptom of a far deeper, that is to say, a sickness within American society, internal violence, racism, and social polarization. He names what's wrong. And he coming to the conclusion of the speech, he says, in the name of anti-communism, the United States stands opposed to the rightful demands of oppressed people everywhere seeking freedom and dignity. And he then calls upon the population, especially the Black population, to protest in whatever way they can, way they can. Well, Johnson is floored by what King does. And I'll end by noting that even beyond Martin Luther King at this point, the heavyweight champion of the world, people paid attention, Muhammad Ali. Tell me, does anybody know who Muhammad Ali was? What you know? What? Who was he? Muhammad Ali. Who is this guy?
The most famous boxer
Yeah,
in
he
the
was.
history of boxing.
He was possibly the greatest boxer in world history. It was incredible. You've never seen somebody as smooth as this guy. And also, he was a poet at the same time. Well, he says, I'll show you this at the beginning of next class. He's interviewed and he says, the Viet Cong, they done me no harm. I've got no problem with this. They never called me a nigger. He's talking about these white racist bigots. Those are his enemies. He says, I'm not going to fight the Viet Cong. I'm fighting these people in the United States. So what I guess I'm saying is, yes, the thing is that the situation explodes at the Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive is the climax of all of this. And it blows away Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson is finished, as you'll see in the next class.